So this talk is titled Don't Fear the Cascade, and I want to talk about not the dish soap. I want to talk about CSS, specifically C and CSS. The cascade is probably the reason why CSS gets such a bad rap among developers, and it can be genuinely puzzling if you don't take the time to understand it. But that's why I'm giving this talk. The cascade doesn't have to be this unknown, scary thing. If you haven't been keeping up, CSS has legitimately become awesome. We have the has pseudo class and nesting built into CSS now. We're even getting scope styling. How awesome is that? And for the first time ever, we have the tools to manage the cascade in a way that feels more hinged, for lack of a better word. Um, so yeah, this is a vast topic with multiple layers of rabbit holes. So to keep things digestible, I will simplify my explanations and provide practical suggestions along the way. So to understand the cascade, we're going to start with like a completely blank slate with the minimum amount of HTML required to style a page, or create a page rather. We're not even going to style it. And let's put a humble button element in there. And immediately we can see that this button element still has some default styling, even though there's no CSS on the page. So earlier, Miriam already explained this in some more detail, but these default styles come from the user agent style sheet. And yes, these default styles do respect the light and dark theme. So like my system, operating system uses dark theme. So this button is styled in a dark theme. I won't spoil the surprise because I'm sure Sarah is going to talk about this later today. But yeah, you can have dark theme without writing CSS. So yeah, the user agent style sheet is literally a CSS file, but built into the browser. This is where the cascade starts. So on this slide, I have a screenshot of Chromium's user agent style sheet. I went to their source code and found it there. This file is like some hundreds of lines long. Specifically, I'm showing a small subsection where this rule affects inputs, text areas, and buttons. And this rule sets a font property. This font property is probably the reason why every CSS reset that you see uses something like font inherit on inputs, text areas, and buttons, just so that these elements will match their the font size and font family of their surroundings. So yeah, this is the first step in the cascade, and then come author styles. This is the more interesting part. This is where the party happens. Before that, though, I just want to talk about Shadow DOM real quick. Bear with me. If you're not familiar, Shadow DOM allows you to attach an internal DOM tree to an element. And this internal tree can have any arbitrary DOM structure, which is hidden from the main DOM. And yeah, so that unlocks some cool things like encapsulated styling. And even if you don't like using Shadow DOM directly, which is totally understandable, um, it's still good to know because many built-in elements use Shadow DOM underneath. And I've written this handy blog post if you want to learn more. But yeah, essentially, I explain how Shadow DOM works here, and I have this animation showing how the light DOM and Shadow DOM are interleaved together. I think the animation, okay, I explained, cool. And yeah, I have a screenshot of the details element, which shows that the details element, which is built into like HTML itself, also uses Shadow DOM. So even if you don't use it directly, you are using Shadow DOM indirectly. And yeah, the reason I bring this up is Shadow DOM styles cascade after the user agent styles, but before the rest of the page styles. So if you have a My Button component which slots a regular button, and you style this button both from inside and outside Shadow DOM, the outside styles will win. So the overall cascade order so far goes something like the user agent styles, the author styles, and within the author styles, the Shadow DOM styles, and then the rest of the page styles. There's also the inline style attribute, which comes after all of these, but that's like not really part of the cascade. Like the browser doesn't need to resolve um, the cascade in order to get the style attribute because it's literally attached to the element itself. But yeah, now that we understand Shadow DOM, we can talk about the rest of the page. And the first and most simple concept there is order of appearance. So for example, you can style a button using an element selector, and you can make it hot pink, pretty straightforward. But what happens when there's two of these rules? The last one wins. This makes sense. CSS written, it goes from like top to bottom, and the last one overrides anything before it. But these element selectors aren't super useful on their own. What if you only want to style this one particular button? This is where we use a class instead of an element selector. But when we do this, we find that the order of appearance seems to not matter anymore. The class selector wins over the element selector, even if it comes before. So what's going on here? And the answer to that is specificity. Hopefully I said that right. Specificity. Um, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because it's a complex but pretty easily understood topic. Um, but the gist of it is specificity is a score made of three parts. Starting from the right side, elements and pseudo-element selectors contribute to the least significant part. Classes and attribute selectors and pseudo-classes go in the middle, and IDs go in the most significant part. So the browser will like take the score and use it to determine which selector wins. Chrome DevTools even shows you the specificity when you hover a selector. So if I go and inspect this and I hover over a selector, you can see it says 201. That's the specificity score. So yeah, you don't have to calculate it by hand essentially. So in the previous example, the specificity of the button selector, the button class, was 010, but the specificity of the button element selector was 001. So the button class wins because it's more specific, despite order of appearance. As you can imagine, with really large selectors, the specificity would become a bit cumbersome to manage. And that's why the general advice given to us is keep specificity low. And this is good advice. We should like almost certainly avoid ID selectors, for example, and we can still use them. Like instead of using pound ID, we can just use an attribute selector instead. Or we can just like make a class specifically for the thing that we're selecting. So it's easy to understand the problem with high specificity, but keeping specificity low can sometimes be challenging, especially when you want to share styles between different elements. So you might you might be tempted to make um, a single class for every variant of the button, but like each variant still needs to share the base styles of the button, right? And that kind of starts to become complicated. And I think sometimes we tend to go too far with this advice, um, where we want to keep specificity not just low, but like totally flat by only using single class selectors. This usually is done through a convention like BEM or through tooling like CSS modules. Um, and yeah, I've always just found this kind of advice a bit restrictive. It kind of feels like using CSS without the cascade. So yeah, for the rest of the presentation, I want to show you how much better things can be with modern CSS. The two topics that I would broadly cover are controlling specificity and controlling the cascade itself. So let's start with the easy one. You might already know that you can like increase the specificity of a class selector by chaining it to itself. You can even use CSS nesting to chain nested ampersands, and that way you like avoid repeating yourself. This can be pretty useful when you need it, but it only increases the middle portion of the specificity. Now, this next part might kind of blow your mind, but you can use the is pseudo class to make a huge jump in specificity. This is pseudo class is interesting. It lets you group multiple selectors into a single selector, but it changes the specificity of the whole thing so that only the strongest selector in the group counts. What this means is you can have a class selector act like it has the specificity of the ID selector. And this ID selector doesn't even need to exist. It can just be there hanging by itself. You can do the same thing even easier using the not pseudo class. So this one kind of requires you to use the impossible selector where you can use two IDs because remember, an element can only have one ID. So this selector would never match. And we're saying never not match the selector. So this will match the thing that you chain it to. I love this because you can chain it to anything to scope it down just how much you want while retaining the super high specificity. And if you chain it to the universal selector, it will match everything while having the high specificity that we want. You shouldn't need this very often, but it's so handy when you just want to like have certain styles have the highest priority. So with that out of the way, let's talk about decreasing specificity. We know how to increase it, but how do we decrease it? Because that's kind of the goal, right? We want to keep specificity low. At least that's what everybody tells us. So that's where the var pseudo class comes in. Var is just like is, except it doesn't add to the specificity. You can put an ID selector in there and it will still have 0 specificity. And just like is, you can chain it to other selectors. So um, you can like have some parts inside the var, they don't count towards the specificity, but the things that are outside do count. There's one restriction here. You can't put a pseudo element selector inside is and where, but that's just a thing that you'll get used to. But yeah, in other words, we now have a CSS native way of writing any kind of selector we want with just the right amount of specificity. That's awesome. CSS is awesome. So the most obvious way to use where is when you want to create 0 specificity selectors for a CSS reset. This kind of makes sense because you want the reset to have the lowest cascade priority. So you just put everything in where. And I've actually built my own reset that uses this technique. And you can find it on NPM under the @acab namespace. With where, you can make everything 0 specificity, but maybe don't do that. 0 is fine for resets, but I would actually suggest coming up with a desired specificity for all your other styles. So you might want your global style to be no higher than 001. And you can like still use longer selectors there while like restricting the specificity. And yeah, you can, the point here is you can like kind of just control the specificity while not having any restrictions on how you're writing your CSS. One thing that I like to do is like put everything that is nested inside the main rule, put where, so that like the whole block has a flat specificity and everything inside it has like 0 specificity. So you're like going top to down, everything is like using source order or order of appearance, and like everything inside is flat. So you have some specificity, just not too much. So yeah, if you haven't used where, give it a shot. It will probably solve many of your headaches. And it's very well supported all the way back to Safari 14. And that brings us to my favorite topic, controlling the cascade using layers. So if you have a CSS rule, you can wrap it in a layer. This is an anonymous layer. And you can give it a name, and you can put other styles in it too. So far, so good. But the interesting part is when you use multiple layer statements and put different, or multiple layer blocks and put different styles in them. So here, the second layer will always be the first layer. It's kind of like order of appearance, but without the specificity part. So here in the second layer, we're using a where pseudo class, but the first one still wins. Or actually, I misspoke. So in the second one, we're using the very pseudo class, so it has a lower specificity, but it still wins because it's in a layer that comes later. So the layer order is kind of resolved in the way, in the order that is defined. And then there's unlayered styles, which always have the highest priority. They will win over all layer styles. This might not feel intuitive, but it kind of makes sense and you'll get used to it, because the way I think about it is you want to start with your lower priority layer. So you can like put your CSS reset in a layer and leave everything else unlayered. This kind of allows you to like slowly add layers to your code base. So yeah, that's kind of an introduction to layer. I still have some time, so I'm going to dive a little bit deeper. So I mentioned layer order. The layers are prioritized in the order that they first appear. So if you have layer A, layer B, and then you write layer A again, the rules inside the second occurrence of layer A will still lose to layer B because the layer A was like already defined all the way up there. To make this more predictable, you can separate layer statements from layer blocks. The layer statement will define the order, and the layer blocks will contain the actual rules. And you probably want to define the layer order up front because all your other styles, or before all your other styles, you can put the layer statements in the beginning of your first style sheet. But what I like to do is I put it in style tag, and I put that style tag all the way up in the head because I don't trust bundlers to put my first style sheet in the correct place. So I just like doing it myself before any other style sheets are linked. So yeah, let's go even deeper. So we can nest layers. This functionality is built into layers. So it's separate from CSS nesting. You can like nest layers without using CSS nesting. And if you only want to reference a nested sublayer, you can also use the dot syntax. But it gets even more interesting when you do use CSS nesting, because you can put a layer block inside another CSS rule, like a class selector. This is useful when you want to style different parts of the same component using different layers. I do want to point out that the CSS nesting is a relatively new feature, so you might want to use like preprocessors, like PostCSS or Sass, to like transpile this part out for you. Yeah, this pattern I find useful, especially when like different parts of the same component need to have different priorities. So for example, I might have overrides as a sublayer where I put all my forced color styles and print styles, because these should always like be at all the other styles of the component. Moving on, layers transcend the idea of style sheets. So you can reference the same layer name in multiple CSS files, and they'll work just like you expect, regardless of how they're imported. So you might have like a giant components layer that is referenced in every single one of your components, and even within single file components in like Svelte or Vue or Astro. You can also import an external CSS file into a layer. Like that external CSS file doesn't even need to contain any layers. And I want to give a shout out to post CSS import here. You can like transform these import statements into layer block statements and like inline all the contents of the style sheet. And it even works for remote URLs. This is great for performance mainly. And I want to talk about Sass real quick. Sass, so layers work just as you'd expect in Sass, but like when you want to combine multiple Sass files into a single layer, you need to use meta.load.css. You can't use the use statement. This was a recent update made to Sass to ensure that meta.load.css is like canonical way to use layers in Sass. And finally, the most important slide. You might have used the important keyword to win specificity battles in the past, but we all know it's a shameful hack, and the general advice is to avoid important. And earlier, I already showed various ways to increase specificity. So if you just want to win a specificity battle, then use one of those techniques instead of important. But the reason important is interesting here is it works kind of differently in layers. So the important keyword is more important when used in lower priority layers. This feels strange, but I think Miriam was explaining earlier that user agents and user preferences might want to declare some styles that are legitimately important. So even though all the other user agent styles are less important, they want to say this particular thing should be more important. So it works similarly in layers. So in a CSS reset, you might have a rule that says display not important if the dialog is not open. This kind of helps ensure that subsequent layers can't accidentally override the display when it's always meant to be hidden. I've done that accidentally so many times where I set a display grid on the dialog and it just like shows when it's not supposed to be showing. So now I handle it in my reset instead. So if you take everything we've seen about layers so far, our cascade order looks something like the user agent styles, then the page styles, and the shadow DOM styles with their layer order and the unlayered styles, and then the inline style attribute. And then the important styles come after all of that. And Since I'm running out of time, I won't go into too much detail here, but like important styles also have their own perks in that the user agent important styles are more important than like inline style attributes, for example. But yeah, I want to talk about browser support real quick. So browser, um, I think 2022 February is when all browsers shipped Cascade layers. So it was like a coordinated rollout, and it was very impressive to watch. But if that still makes you uneasy, there's post CSS Cascade layers, which polyfills everything that we've talked about so far. And then there's revert layer. I haven't like talked about it so far because it's like such a vast topic. But more importantly, it cannot be polyfilled, so you might not want to use it yet. I have a blog post on this topic, and the only part I want to mention just right now is that if you're trying to use revert, consider using revert layer instead. It works even when you don't use cascade layers. Then there's some best practices. I think I'll skip that. Slides are stuck. Oh no. Okay, sure. There was an iframe here where I was going to show that layers and scope are different. So this is a CSS Tricks article written by Miriam Suzanne. And yeah, I really want to emphasize this point is that layers and scopes are different things. So you don't want to create like a layer for every single component. They can overlap. So you can have layers within the same component, but like don't use it to scope your CSS. And I think we can wrap it up here since I ran out of time. But I just want to mention one last thing. That I think Peter Griffin would really enjoy using cascade layers. So yeah, that's all. If you want to learn more, subscribe to my RSS feed. And that's all from me.